I hadn't been back to my grandmother's village since I was a kid. The place was just as I remembered it. A cluster of old, wooden houses huddled together against the relentless cold, surrounded by thick, towering trees. The air smelled of pine and smoke, and even in the daylight, the sky seemed permanently gray. Snow clung to every surface, muting the world with its heavy blanket. It was the kind of cold that felt like it would seep into your bones and never leave. I arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the narrow, empty streets. My grandmother's house was at the edge of the village, almost swallowed by the forest. It was a two-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The porch creaked under my weight as I knocked on the door, a sound that echoed through the stillness. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing my grandmother's small figure. She smiled when she saw me, her face wrinkled and worn, but there was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Evan, you've come," she said softly, pulling me into a tight embrace. I returned the hug, feeling the frailty of her frame. "I'm here, Grandma." She stepped back, her hands lingering on my arms. "Come inside. It's too cold to be standing out there." The house hadn't changed much either. It was as if time had stood still in this place. The same faded wallpaper, the same heavy, worn furniture, and the same old fireplace that crackled weakly against the biting chill. I set my bags down by the door and took a moment to soak it all in. I'd come back to this place hoping for some peace and quiet after everything that had happened, but now that I was here, I wasn't so sure. "How was your journey?" my grandmother asked, bustling into the kitchen to prepare some tea. "Long," I replied, taking a seat by the fire. "But I'm glad to be here." She returned with 2 steaming mugs and sat across from me, watching me carefully. "It's good to have you back. The village has been so quiet these past few years." I nodded, sipping my tea. The warmth spread through me, but it didn't do much to chase away the unease that had settled in my stomach. The village was quiet, too quiet. There was an emptiness that I couldn't quite place, a heaviness in the air that felt different from the usual isolation of winter. I hadn't noticed it as a child, but now, it pressed down on me with a strange intensity. As the night wore on, my grandmother and I talked about everything and nothing. Old memories, how the village had changed, the weather. But when the conversation lulled, and a silence settled between us, she looked at me with a seriousness that made my skin prickle. "Evan," she began, her voice low, "there's something you should know." I leaned forward, my heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" She glanced toward the window, where the snow was falling thick and fast. "This village, it's not the same as it used to be. There have been disappearances. Children, mostly." "Disappearances?" I echoed, frowning. "What do you mean?" She sighed deeply, her gaze distant. "It's hard to explain. The forest, it's not safe anymore. People say the children are drawn to it, and once they go in, they don't come back." A chill ran down my spine, though I wasn't sure if it was from her words or the draft creeping in through the cracks in the walls. "What do you mean, drawn to it?" My grandmother shook her head slowly. "Strange things happen here, Evan. The kind of things that are hard to believe unless you've seen them yourself. But I'm telling you this for a reason. Whatever you do, stay away from the woods. Promise me." I wanted to dismiss her warning as superstition, as nothing more than the fears of an old woman, but there was something in her eyes that made me hesitate. She wasn't just being overprotective, she was afraid. And that fear was contagious. "I promise," I said finally, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. She nodded, seeming satisfied, but the tension between us didn't fade. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, I couldn't help but glance toward the window. The snow was falling heavier now, covering everything in a thick, white shroud. The village looked peaceful, serene even, but beneath that peaceful exterior, something dark was lurking. I could feel it, even if I didn't understand it yet. That night, as I lay in bed, wrapped in heavy blankets, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept drifting back to my grandmother's words, to the stories of the disappearances, to the forest that loomed just beyond the edge of the village. I listened to the wind whistling outside, carrying with it the faintest sound, like children laughing or maybe crying. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew better. This village wasn't the same as I remembered. And whatever had changed, I was about to find out. The next morning, I woke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the frost-covered windows. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My grandmother had already gone out, likely to run her morning errands in the village. I decided to explore the house, see if anything had changed since I was last here. As I wandered through the old rooms, memories of my childhood visits came flooding back. The creaking floorboards, the smell of the old wood, even the small trinkets that decorated the shelves, all of it was the same. But there was something off about it now, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was as if the house itself was holding on to secrets, ones that I wasn't meant to uncover. I found myself drawn to the attic, a place I hadn't ventured into since I was a child. The narrow staircase creaked under my weight as I climbed, and a musty smell hit me as I pushed open the door. The attic was dimly lit by a single dust-covered window, and it was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten memories. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, a sense of unease settling over me. As I rummaged through the boxes, I came across an old leather-bound album. The cover was cracked with age, and the pages were yellowed and fragile. I flipped through it, expecting to find old family photos, but what I found instead sent a chill down my spine. The album was filled with pictures of children, dozens of them, all dressed in old-fashioned winter clothes, smiling and playing in the snow. But something was wrong. As I looked closer, I realized that the faces of the children in the photos were eerily familiar. Too familiar. My heart skipped a beat as recognition dawned on me. These were the faces of the children who had gone missing over the years, the same ones my grandmother had warned me about. I stared at the photographs, my mind racing. How was this possible? The pictures looked ancient, but the children, they hadn't aged. They were the same as the ones who had disappeared recently. My hands trembled as I flipped through the album, each page revealing more of the same. Children laughing, building snowmen, skating on a frozen pond. And in every picture, there was something in the background, something I hadn't noticed at first. A dark shadow, barely visible, lurking just at the edge of the frame. I closed the album with a snap, my heart pounding in my chest. The air in the attic felt suddenly suffocating, and I hurried back down the stairs, the album clutched tightly in my hands. I needed to talk to my grandmother, to ask her what this was, but as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I hesitated. Would she even tell me the truth? I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was still early, and she wouldn't be back for a while. I decided to take another look at the album, hoping to make sense of what I'd found. But as I sat down at the kitchen table and opened it again, the pictures seemed even more disturbing. The children's smiles were too wide, their eyes too bright. And that shadow, it was closer in some of the pictures, as if it were moving toward them. I slammed the album shut, unable to look at it any longer. My mind was racing with questions, but no answers came. All I knew was that something was very wrong in this village, and whatever it was, it had something to do with these children, and with the forest. The unease from the previous night had returned, stronger than before. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I was alone in the house. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like the walls were closing in on me. I needed to get out of the house, to clear my head. But as I reached for my coat, I paused, glancing out the window toward the forest. The snow was falling again, thick and heavy, and the trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind. Something was out there, something that didn't want to be found. And somehow, I knew that whatever it was watching me. The snow fell heavier as I stepped outside, each flake clinging to my coat and hair, weighing me down with an inexplicable sense of dread. The cold air stung my face, but I welcomed it, hoping that the bite of winter would shake off the unease that had settled deep in my bones. I needed to clear my head, to make sense of the strange discovery in the attic, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of those children, smiling, frozen in time, and yet somehow hauntingly alive. I walked aimlessly through the village, the streets nearly empty save for a few villagers huddled in their doorways, eyeing me with suspicion. Their gazes lingered on me, whispering behind their scarves as I passed. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, but I kept my head down, pushing forward into the heart of the village until I reached the outskirts, the edge of the woods. I wasn't sure why I was drawn there. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper, something I couldn't explain. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a low whisper, like a voice on the edge of hearing. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood at the tree line, staring into the dark expanse of the forest. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my mind, but something else was pulling me forward, something I couldn't resist. I stepped into the woods, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The trees closed in around me, their branches heavy with snow, creating a canopy that blocked out what little light remained. The world felt different here, as though I had crossed into another realm, a place where time stood still and the rules of reality didn't apply. The further I walked, the more I felt it, the presence. It was subtle at first, a soft sensation in the back of my mind, like being watched from a distance. But as I continued deeper into the woods, it grew stronger, more tangible. I could almost feel eyes on me, watching from behind the trees, just out of sight. I quickened my pace, my breath coming out in sharp puffs of steam. The whispering grew louder, and I realized it wasn't just the wind. It was voices, dozens of them, faint and distant, but unmistakably human. Children's voices. I stopped, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked around, but there was no one there, only the trees and the endless blanket of snow. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the forest, bouncing off the trunks like some twisted game of hide and seek. My pulse quickened as the feeling of being watched intensified, and I could swear I saw movement in the shadows, quick flashes of something darting between the trees. I took a step back, my mind racing. I shouldn't be here. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run back to the safety of my grandmother's house, but my feet refused to move. Something was keeping me here, holding me in place. And then I saw it. In the distance, just beyond the reach of the trees, stood a small, crumbling cabin. Its roof sagged under the weight of the snow, and the windows were dark and lifeless, but I felt drawn to it. The whispers grew louder as I approached, my legs moving on their own, carrying me toward the cabin even as my mind screamed for me to stop. I reached the door and hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. The door creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the silence, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of rot, and the floorboards groaned beneath my weight. The cabin was small, barely more than a single room, with a rusted stove in one corner and a rickety bed in the other. But what caught my attention were the toys, small, scattered across the floor as if left behind in a hurry. Dolls, wooden blocks, a small stuffed bear, all coated in a fine layer of dust, untouched for years. My breath caught in my throat as I knelt down to examine one of the toys, a small, hand-carved figure of a child. The detail was exquisite, right down to the tiny smile etched into its face. But as I held it in my hand, that smile seemed to twist into something far more sinister. I dropped the toy, my heart racing. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and I could feel the presence closing in on me. I turned toward the door, ready to flee, but as I stepped outside, I froze. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, were the children. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes, wide and empty, stared back at me. They were the same children from the photographs, but they weren't smiling now. Their expressions were twisted with something darker, something malevolent. I took a step back, my body trembling with fear. The children didn't move, but their eyes followed me, unblinking. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me like a storm, and I felt my chest tighten with panic. I turned and ran, my boots slipping in the snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees blurred around me as I sprinted through the forest, the children's voices echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the village, stumbling out of the woods and collapsing onto the snow-covered road. The whispers faded, replaced by the distant hum of the village. I glanced back at the forest, my heart still racing. The children were gone, but their presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to fade. I had gone into the woods seeking answers, but all I had found were more questions. And now, I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to escape what I had seen. I didn't tell my grandmother about what happened in the woods that night. Something held me back. Maybe it was the look in her eyes whenever she mentioned the disappearances, or maybe it was the gnawing sense of dread that had taken root in my chest since I'd seen those children. Whatever it was, I kept the experience to myself, locking it away in the corners of my mind as I tried to make sense of everything. But the memory of the children's faces haunted me, and I knew I couldn't ignore it for long. A few days later, I met up with Thomas, my childhood friend who had never left the village. He was one of the few people who didn't avoid me, though there was something different about him now, something I couldn't quite place. He seemed more reserved, his usual carefree demeanor replaced by an air of caution. Still, I needed someone to talk to, someone who might understand. We met at the edge of the village, near the frozen pond where we used to play as kids. The snow was still falling, soft and relentless, and the wind bit at our exposed skin as we walked. "You've been back for a while now," Thomas said, breaking the silence. "How are you finding things?" I shrugged, keeping my gaze fixed on the ground. "It's different. Quieter than I remember." "Quieter, yeah," he said with a bitter laugh. "That's one way to put it." I hesitated for a moment, then decided to take the plunge. "Do you know anything about the disappearances? The children?" Thomas's expression darkened, and he glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. "You shouldn't be asking about that, Evan. It's not something people here like to talk about." "I've already seen something," I said quietly. "In the woods." He stopped walking and turned to face me, his eyes wide with alarm. "You went into the woods?" I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I don't know what I saw. But it was real, Thomas. The children. "You need to stop," he interrupted, his voice urgent. "Whatever you think you saw, whatever you think you know, it's best to forget about it. Trust me, Evan. Some things are better left alone." His words didn't sit right with me. There was a desperation in his tone, and I could tell he was hiding something. "What aren't you telling me?" Thomas sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, the village, it has its secrets, okay? Things have been happening here for a long time. But if you keep digging, you're only going to make it worse for yourself." I stared at him, feeling a mixture of frustration and fear. "So what? I'm just supposed to ignore everything? Pretend like it's all normal?" "That's exactly what you're supposed to do," he said, his voice low. "You came back here to get away from everything, right? Then don't go looking for trouble." His words echoed in my mind as we walked in silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was wrong. There was something in this village, something that needed to be uncovered, no matter how dangerous it was. And I couldn't just let it go. Later that day, I returned to my grandmother's house, determined to find answers. The old album still sat on the kitchen table, and I couldn't bring myself to open it again. But there had to be more, something that could explain what I had seen. I remembered my grandmother's attic and the strange feeling I had when I first went up there. Maybe there was something I missed. I made my way back up the narrow staircase, the wooden steps creaking beneath my weight. The attic was just as I had left it, dusty and cluttered, filled with forgotten relics of the past. I began searching through the boxes, my fingers brushing against old trinkets and faded photographs. And then, at the bottom of a stack of boxes, I found it, an old, tattered diary, its pages yellowed with age. I opened the diary carefully, the brittle pages crumbling slightly at the edges. The handwriting was neat but shaky, as if written by a child. As I read, my heart began to race. The diary belonged to a boy who had lived in the village decades ago, long before I was born. He wrote about strange happenings in the woods, voices calling to him, shadows that moved in the trees, and children who disappeared without a trace. One entry stood out to me more than the others. "They come at night, whispering my name. I see them in the snow, their faces pale and cold. They want me to join them, but I'm too scared. I know what happens to the children who go into the woods. They never come back." The diary ended abruptly, with no explanation of what happened to the boy. But it was clear that he had been afraid, just as I was now. I closed the diary, my hands trembling. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was darker than I had imagined. The village wasn't just hiding secrets, it was cursed, haunted by something far more sinister than I could have ever believed. And now, I was in the middle of it. I couldn't sleep that night. The weight of what I had read in the diary pressed down on me, filling my thoughts with images of pale faces and whispered voices. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards as the wind rattled against the windows. Every sound made me jump, and I found myself straining to listen for something, anything, that might betray the presence of the children outside. But there was nothing, just the howling wind and the unrelenting cold. The next morning, I sat down with my grandmother at the breakfast table, the tattered diary hidden in my lap. She was unusually quiet, her eyes distant as she sipped her tea. I watched her for a moment, debating whether or not to bring it up. Part of me feared her reaction, but the other part of me needed to know the truth. I set the diary down on the table between us, flipping it open to one of the boys' entries. "Do you know anything about this?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "About what's happening in the woods?" Her eyes flicked down to the diary, and for a moment her face went pale. She didn't speak right away, her hands trembling as she placed her teacup down with a soft clink. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "In the attic," I replied. I saw something, Grandma. In the woods. And the children in these pictures, they match the ones in the album. What's happening here?" She closed her eyes, sighing deeply, as though the weight of the world had suddenly settled on her shoulders. "Evan," she began slowly, "there are things in this village that shouldn't be spoken of. Things that we've tried to forget, but they never go away." I leaned forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean? What's going on?" She was silent for a long time, staring down at the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with a sorrow I had never heard before. "It started decades ago, long before you were born. Reverend Turner, he tried to save his daughter. She was sick, dying. He was desperate, and in his desperation, he turned to something unnatural." I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened. "What did he do?" "He performed a ritual," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "A ritual to save her life. But something went wrong. The ritual failed, and instead of saving her, it cursed this village. The children, they're drawn to the forest. And once they go in, they never come back." I stared at her, my mind reeling. "So, the children that disappeared?" She nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "Their spirits are trapped in the forest, Evan. They're not alive, but they're not truly dead either. They're stuck in between, and they want to drag others into that same limbo." I felt a sickening twist in my stomach. "But why? Why are they doing this?" She wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling. "I don't know. Maybe they're angry, or maybe they're just lost. All I know is that the forest isn't safe, and it hasn't been for a very long time." I sat back in my chair, trying to process everything she had told me. The village was cursed, haunted by the restless spirits of children trapped in a liminal space between life and death. Reverend Turner's ritual had unleashed something dark, and now the village was paying the price. My grandmother reached across the table, her hand covering mine. "You need to leave, Evan. Get out of this village while you still can. There's nothing here for you but danger." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "I can't just leave, Grandma. Not after what I've seen. There has to be a way to stop this." She shook her head sadly. "There isn't. Believe me, we've tried. But no one ever comes back from the woods." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but deep down, I knew I couldn't just walk away. I couldn't leave the village to suffer under this curse, not when I was so close to understanding it. That night, the dreams returned, vivid and unsettling. The children were there, standing in the snow, their eyes wide and hollow, beckoning me toward the forest. And at the center of it all was Reverend Turner's daughter, her face pale and ghostly, her eyes filled with something far darker than sorrow. She smiled at me, her voice echoing through my mind, "Join us." The days that followed were a blur of tension and unease. My grandmother's warning rang in my head, but something stronger, a force I couldn't quite explain, kept drawing me back toward the forest. I spent hours sitting by the window, watching the snow fall, feeling the invisible pull of the woods on the edge of the village. The spirits of the children haunted my thoughts, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw their pale, hollow faces staring back at me. But it wasn't just the spirits that troubled me. It was Thomas. He had been acting strangely ever since our conversation by the frozen pond. His eyes, once filled with warmth and familiarity, now held a coldness that unnerved me. He avoided me when we crossed paths in the village, and when he did speak to me, his words were short and clipped, as though he wanted nothing to do with me. One evening, after another restless day, Thomas appeared at my grandmother's door. His eyes darted nervously as he asked me to join him for a walk. He was insistent, his urgency barely concealed behind a thin veneer of casual conversation. Despite my misgivings, I agreed, hoping that he might finally open up about what was happening in the village. The cold was biting as we made our way through the narrow streets, our footsteps the only sound breaking the stillness. We walked in silence, the snow crunching beneath our boots, until we reached the edge of the village. The dark line of trees loomed ahead, and a familiar sense of dread crept over me. "I've been thinking about what you said," Thomas began, his voice low. "About the children. About the woods." I glanced at him, trying to read his expression in the dim light. "And? You were right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something out there. Something evil. But if we're going to stop it, we need to confront it." His words sent a shiver down my spine. "You think we can stop it?" He nodded. "I know it sounds crazy, but I've been doing some research. There's a way to break the curse, to free the children." I narrowed my eyes, suspicion creeping into my mind. "How do you know that?" He hesitated for a moment before replying. "There's a place in the woods, a clearing. That's where it all started. If we go there, we can undo what Reverend Turner did. We just need to be brave enough to face it." I wanted to believe him, but something about his tone, about the way his eyes refused to meet mine, set off alarm bells in my head. Still, my curiosity and my desperation to end the nightmare pushed me forward. "Fine," I said, swallowing my fear. "Let's go." We stepped into the forest, the world around us growing darker with each passing step. The trees seemed to close in, their branches like twisted hands reaching for us. The whispering started again, faint at first but growing louder as we ventured deeper into the woods. I followed Thomas through the snow, my heart pounding in my chest. The path grew narrower, the trees thicker, and soon the moonlight barely filtered through the canopy above. My breath came out in sharp gasps, each one visible in the freezing air. The whispers surrounded us, circling like a gathering storm. Then we reached the clearing. It was eerily quiet, the snow-covered ground untouched by footprints. The trees formed a perfect circle around the open space, their gnarled branches twisting overhead. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone altar, covered in ice and dusted with snow. "This is it," Thomas said, his voice tense. "This is where it all began." I took a step forward, but something held me back. A strange sense of foreboding washed over me, and I turned to look at Thomas. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, but not of the forest. "Thomas," I said slowly, "what are we really doing here?" Before he could answer, I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there, just the trees and the endless snow. When I turned back to Thomas, I saw the truth in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I had no choice." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about breaking the curse. Thomas had led me here as a sacrifice. Before I could react, shadows began to emerge from the trees, surrounding us. The children, pale, ghostly figures with hollow eyes, crept toward me, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. I backed away, my heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The clearing felt like a trap, the trees closing in on all sides. "Thomas!" I shouted, but he was already retreating, his face contorted with guilt and fear. "Thomas, don't do this." But it was too late. The children were upon me, their cold hands reaching out, their whispers filling my mind with a terrible, aching emptiness. I stumbled back, my vision swimming, and the last thing I saw before the world went dark was their faces, twisted with pain, anger, and something far worse. When I awoke, the world was quiet. The cold seeped into my bones, and my breath formed small clouds in the still air. I blinked against the white light of the snow-covered clearing, disoriented and shivering. Slowly, I became aware of my surroundings. The children were gone, and Thomas was nowhere to be seen. I was alone. For a moment, I thought I had dreamt it all, that the children, the whispers, the betrayal had been some nightmare born from my exhaustion. But as I sat up, I felt the lingering cold where the children's hands had grasped me, the weight of their whispers still pressing on my mind. It was real, too real. And then I saw him. Standing at the edge of the clearing, his figure half obscured by the trees, was Reverend Turner. His face was gaunt, his skin pale as though he had been dead for years, but his eyes gleamed with something dark, something that sent a shiver of fear down my spine. "I see you found your way to the heart of it all," he said softly, his voice carrying through the still air like the whisper of a ghost. "You shouldn't have come here." I scrambled to my feet, my pulse racing. "What do you want?" He took a step forward, his gaze never leaving mine. "I didn't want this," he said, his voice cracking with something that might have been sorrow. "None of this was meant to happen. But I tried to save my daughter, and instead, I damned us all." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is there a way to stop it? To undo the curse?" Reverend Turner looked down at the snow, his expression haunted. "There is, but it will not come without a cost." I clenched my fists, determination surging through me. "Tell me what I need to do." He raised his eyes to meet mine again, and in them, I saw the weight of decades of guilt and pain. "There is a ritual," he said, his voice soft. "It must be performed here, where it all began. But to break the curse, you must give up something precious. A part of yourself that cannot be regained. A sacrifice." My heart skipped a beat. "What kind of sacrifice?" He stepped closer, his eyes dark and hollow. "You must sacrifice a memory of someone you love, a memory that defines you. Only then will the spirits be released from their torment." I stared at him, my mind racing. A memory? My thoughts instantly went to my mother, to the moments we had shared before her death. The idea of giving up a piece of her, of losing that connection forever, made my chest tighten with grief. But I knew I had no choice. If I didn't do this, the curse would continue, and more lives would be lost. With a heavy heart, I nodded. "I'll do it." Reverend Turner gestured to the stone altar at the center of the clearing. "Place your hands on the stone and close your eyes. Focus on the memory you wish to give up. When you are ready, speak the words I tell you." I hesitated only for a moment before stepping toward the altar. The stone was cold beneath my palms, rough and unyielding. I closed my eyes, my breath trembling as I thought of my mother, the way she used to laugh, the warmth of her embrace, the sound of her voice calling my name. Tears welled in my eyes as I realized what I was about to lose, but I forced myself to stay focused. Reverend Turner's voice was low and steady as he recited the words of the ritual, guiding me through the process. Each word felt heavy with meaning, and as I spoke them aloud, I could feel something shifting in the air around me. A weight lifting, a presence fading. And then, with the final word, I felt it, the memory slipping away, like sand through my fingers. It was gone. I opened my eyes, blinking against the cold light of the clearing. The weight that had pressed on me for days was gone, and the air felt lighter, less oppressive. The whispers had faded, and the trees seemed less menacing. The curse had been broken. But the cost was real. Reverend Turner nodded solemnly. "It's done," he said softly. "The children are free." I stepped back from the altar, the ache of loss settling in my chest. I had done what needed to be done, but the emptiness left by the sacrifice lingered, a reminder of what I had given up. As I looked around the clearing, the ghostly figures of the children began to fade into the snow, their faces no longer twisted with pain but peaceful. For the first time in what felt like forever, the forest was silent. Reverend Turner turned to leave, his figure growing faint in the distance. I watched him disappear into the trees, knowing that the curse had finally been lifted. But as I stood there, alone in the snow, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost forever, and that the village, despite the broken curse, would never truly be the same. The snow had stopped falling by the time I made my way back to the village. The air was still, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the place for so long had finally lifted. It felt different. Lighter, almost as though a long-forgotten burden had been released. The trees no longer seemed to loom over me with their dark, menacing shadows, and the whispers that had followed me everywhere were finally gone. As I walked through the village streets, I noticed small changes. The windows that had been shut tight were now cracked open, allowing fresh air to flow into the old houses. The villagers, who had once eyed me with suspicion, now watched me with something that resembled relief. It was as if the entire village had been holding its breath for decades, and now they could finally exhale. I stopped at the edge of the village and looked back at the forest, the clearing where the ritual had taken place barely visible through the trees. The memory of what I had sacrificed lingered like a dull ache in my chest, a constant reminder of what it had cost to break the curse. My mother's laugh, her smile, those precious moments were gone now, lost forever in exchange for the freedom of the children's souls. But even as I mourned that loss, I knew it had been the right thing to do. The curse had been broken, and the village could finally begin to heal. The spirits of the children, trapped in limbo for so many years, were free now. Their restless torment had ended. I made my way back to my grandmother's house, feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. She was waiting for me at the door, her face pale with concern. When she saw me, relief washed over her, and she pulled me into a tight embrace. "It's over," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "The curse is broken." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "Thank you, Evan. You've done more than anyone could have ever asked." I smiled weakly, though the weight of my sacrifice still lingered. "It's done." But as I looked out at the forest one last time, I couldn't help but wonder, had the cycle truly been broken? Or had we merely delayed something darker, something that still lurked in the shadows, waiting for its chance to return? If you enjoyed unraveling this, you're in for another spine-tingling tale. Click the video on your screen to discover more eerie stories from the Phantom Story Society, where history's darkest secrets come to life. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Until next time, stay curious and beware of the shadows.